Have you ever wondered what's really going on behind the scenes of a huge, groundbreaking study? It's hardly ever a single eureka moment. It's more like a meticulous and often totally invisible blueprint. Today, we're going to explore that architecture of discovery, the careful planning that separates a decent idea from a real breakthrough.
So, to really get why this planning is so critical, we have to start with a pretty jarring number 90%. Yeah, that's the rough rejection rate for new research that gets submitted to top-tier academic journals. It's an incredibly high bar. It means for every 10 studies that get sent in, 9 get sent right back. That just sets the stakes astronomically high for anyone trying to get new knowledge out into the world. And this really brings us to our main theme for today, all thanks to Benjamin Franklin. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In the world of research, all that meticulous planning up front, that's your ounce of prevention. It's the hard work you do to avoid the pound of cure, which, let's be honest, is a crushing rejection letter after you've poured months or even years of your life into a project. So here's our game plan. We'll start by running the research gauntlet. Then we'll try to bridge the relevance gap. After that, we'll go on the hunt for causality, look at the classic battle of the lab versus the real world, expose the control variable trap, and finally, we'll put it all together in a blueprint for research you can actually trust. First up, the research gauntlet. Because, as you'll see, having a brilliant idea is really just the starting line. And most ideas, well, they just don't make it to the finish. So that 90% rejection rate, it's not because of bad ideas. The real fatal flaw almost always happens right at the very beginning. It's poor planning. The problems are baked into the study's DNA long before a single piece of data is ever collected. And why does this happen so often? Well, there are a few usual suspects. First, there's this idea that you can just use some fancy statistical software to fix a weak study design. Spoiler, you can't. Second, you've got this intense publish or perish pressure in academia, which just leads to people cutting corners. And finally, a lot of training for researchers focuses way too much on analyzing the data, instead of on the actual architecture of the research design itself. Okay, but let's say you've got a perfectly planned study. There's another huge hurdle, making sure the research actually matters to anyone outside of a university. Let's talk about bridging that relevance gap. This is a huge concept in the field called the science-practice gap. Essentially, it's the massive disconnect between all the fascinating knowledge being created inside academia and the practical, useful information that people in business or in government or just in the real world can actually use to solve problems. D.C. Hambrick, who is a president of the Academy of Management, put it, well, pretty bluntly. He called the academic world an incestuous, closed loop. He said researchers just talk to each other, write papers for each other, and then come back the next year to do it all over again, with very little impact on the outside world. So how do we break out of that loop? Well, one solution is a huge shift in mindset toward what's called a design science approach. This approach doesn't just describe the world as it is, it actively tries to improve it. Think of it less like a meteorologist observing the weather and more like an engineer building a shelter. And that brings us to one of the most fundamental goals of any research, the search for causality. Right? It's not enough to know that two things are connected. We need to know if one thing truly causes the other. Now, to make a really convincing case for causation, researchers have to clear 3 critical hurdles. First, the cause and effect have to be associated. They've got to move together in a predictable way. Second, the cause has to happen before the effect. And third, and this is the big one, the really tough one, you have to systematically rule out every other possible explanation for what you're seeing. That third step, that's the real detective work of science. It's not good enough to just identify your main suspect. A great researcher has to eliminate every other possibility to prove that their proposed cause is the only one left standing. This is where so many claims of cause and effect just fall apart. And this hunt for why leads every single researcher straight into a classic dilemma when they're planning a study. The trade-off between the sterile, controlled environment of a lab and the messy, unpredictable reality of the real world. This is called the validity dilemma. On one hand, you have internal validity. This is how confident you are that X really does cause Y. It's highest in a lab, where you can control everything. But on the other hand, you have external validity. How confident you are that your findings actually apply to real people in the real world. This is higher out in the field, where you lose all that control. See the problem? You pretty much always have to sacrifice some of one to get more of the other.
But here's the cool part. Some really exciting new tools are starting to help bridge this gap. Things like experience sampling, which pings people for data right in the middle of their daily lives. Or e-lancing platforms, where you can run real experiments inside actual online workplaces. And of course, virtual reality, which can create these incredibly realistic simulations where researchers still have total control.
All right, now we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to talk about a tool that is super powerful and used everywhere in research, but is also one of the most misunderstood and misused. We're talking about the control variable, and you should really think of it as a double-edged sword. So, what even is a control variable? Well, when researchers can't run a perfect sterile lab experiment, they try to statistically account for all the other factors that might be messing with their results. So if they're studying, say, the link between diet and health, they might control for things like a person's age or how much they exercise. But the real question is, why do they pick the controls they pick? And this is exactly where the trap gets sprung. Way too often, the reasons for including a control aren't based on solid theory. They boil down to things like, well, the last guy did it, or just in case, or my personal favorite, to look more rigorous for the reviewers. And here is the single most dangerous assumption we need to bust right now. Adding more controls does not automatically make a study better or more rigorous. In fact, it can be the exact opposite. When you control for something, you are mathematically stripping its influence away from everything else you're measuring, and that can fundamentally change the very thing you think you're studying. Let me give you a classic example. Imagine you want to study the link between a person's height and how much money they make. Okay, seems simple enough. Now, you decide to control for gender and weight. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? But here's the thing. Once you've done that, you're not really studying height anymore. You're studying the little bit of height that's left over after you've removed everything related to gender and weight. You're actually studying something completely different, something more like physical proportionality. So, how do you avoid this trap? Well, researchers need a disciplined process, like a decision tree. And the very first question has to be, is there a solid theoretical reason to include this control variable in the first place? Okay, if the answer is yes, then you move to the second question. What is its specific purpose here, in this study? It can't just be there because of tradition. It has to have a clear job to do. And finally, the last question is a practical one. Can you even measure this variable reliably? Because if you can't, a poorly measured control can actually introduce more error and noise into your study than it removes. If that's the case, you're better off just leaving it out. And if you think this is a small problem, take a look at this. A review of hundreds of published studies found that a whopping 72% of them justified their control variables just by citing older studies, basically tradition. Only 17% gave a clear theoretical reason. It shows you that for a lot of research, theory is just an afterthought. Okay, let's bring all this together now into a final blueprint. And this isn't just for researchers. This is really a toolkit for all of us to help us become smarter, more critical consumers of all the scientific information that's thrown at us every day. So here it is, the blueprint for research you can trust. Step 1, start with a problem that actually matters in the real world. Step 2, design your study to rigorously test for cause and effect. Step 3, intelligently and consciously balance that trade-off between lab control and real-world relevance. And Step 4, choose your control variables with extreme care, always led by theory, not by tradition. And we're going to end with a quote that just perfectly wraps this all up. It is not possible to put right with statistics what has been done wrong by design. The most powerful computer on Earth, with the most sophisticated software, cannot save a study that was built on a shaky foundation from the very beginning. So I'll just leave you with this question. The next time you see a headline about some amazing new discovery, don't just ask what they found. Ask how they found it. What was the blueprint? What did they plan for? And maybe even more importantly, what did they decide to leave out?